Seahawks fans, wherever you may be, welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Hey, Seahawk fans. Welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, here to talk Seahawks football. Today's kind of a unique show. We're kind of doing a show off of an article, basically. John Boyle for Seahawks.com had some really nice insights into the draft. He was inside the draft room for all 3 days of this year's draft and wrote about essentially what he saw, what he heard, and it was pretty interesting, I thought, and kind of a fun read. And you've probably seen it out there. A few other shows kind of talked about it a little bit, and we're going to kind of do our thing as well. How you doing, Keith?
Doing good. Yeah, it's rare we get one of these things that we're just like, ooh, we really need to talk about this on the show. But this is such a cool, unique insight into everything because he was in the room. Normally there's the war room and there's a camera, like a webcam, peeking in, so that way, and then but the media members are in a different room. So they can see that, but they can't hear anything. And then somebody comes in and tells them who the pick is or what the trade is, usually before it's announced on TV and that kind of stuff. So the media members that are there present have that information and can do stuff with it. But in this case, like, he was literally in the room, listening to the conversations, eavesdropping in on phone calls about trades and all of that kind of stuff. So really, really interesting and unique perspective.
Absolutely. And you and I talk all the time about what we don't know about the draft, about the prospects. We can watch the tape. We can follow their college careers all the way from high school. They go to the combine, they go to the Senior Bowl. We get all of that stuff. But the most important things about each of those players comes with the private meetings, the interviews, the scouts that watch them and interact with their coaches and other players to talk about them and how they deal with adversity and et cetera. As well as then the other side of the coin is this very thing. What actually goes on in the pre-draft process? How do they evaluate players? Where does their board stack up? Now, we didn't get exactly that as far as knowing who all was on their board and so forth, but we did have an idea of kind of how things fell out, the way the draft went, and kind of what they were doing around each one of those picks. That was kind of detailed in this article, and we'll kind of go through a few things. It goes very specifically, pick by pick right at the top, but let's jump into where the Seahawks start, because that's essentially, I think once Arizona traded out of their pick, was kind of the key moment for the Seahawks. They knew they were going to be on track. Basically at that point, Houston came up, grabbed that pick for back-to-back picks in the draft and chose Will Anderson. The Colts then took Anthony Richardson. Seattle then is on the clock. It talks about, John Boyle writes, Schneider calls back the general manager looking to trade up, and the conversation is very brief. We're picking, Schneider says. Snyder's next call is to Witherspoon. And then he called Witherspoon. He said, we had a great visit with you, so we want you to get your ass back out here to Seattle, okay? We're going to select you right here. So these little insights are really kind of cool. We don't actually hear those moments sometimes, and that's great. What do you think about that process early on in the draft, where there was a lot of uncertainty? Even for Seattle, they just really didn't know what teams were going to do in front of them. They had an idea, but it really needed to play out before they kind of knew their own course of action.
Yeah, I mean, the trade with Arizona to made it so that Houston took that pick is the thing that was unique. But in the end, you knew that Young was going first, Stroud was going second,
Right.
Anderson was going third, um, and that there was going to be a quarterback taken for to Indy. We didn't know which one. There's a lot of speculation that it was going to be Will Levis. It ended up being Richardson. I honestly think that if they had taken Levis, Seattle would have taken Richardson there. Or maybe someone would have paid a lot more to move up to get Richardson, and Seattle would
Hmm.
have moved down because now suddenly the asking price just went through the roof, and they were able to get a haul.
There's
But
conflicting reports there, Keith. It's like I think Bob Condata said it was either going to be Witherspoon or it was going to be Anderson, and they felt like they weren't going to be in a position to draft Richardson this year and sit on him based on how much they were going to have to pay at that spot in the draft and the investment at the quarterback position versus taking best player available, which would have been Witherspoon on their board. But when you take a look at positional value, obviously you've got to think at least twice about Richardson there at 5 if he's
mhm,
available. And you kind of solve that position, for the long term right there, potentially.
yeah.
But it's really interesting. It's really
And I also
fascinating
like
to me.
the part that where you read was that Snyder had been on the phone. He had was working on trades. He had talked to another GM of someone who wanted to move up. Um, and when they got to 5 and Witherspoon was there, he just called him back and said, "Now we're picking." Because
Yeah.
he was the guy. This isn't well, we couldn't get a trade work together, and
And
he was
Schneider
the top guy on our
later
board. Like, it
Schneider
wasn't
later
that
said
situation.
that they had options to go back with trade back.
Yeah.
Um, and then he said Witherspoon was our guy. We really knew that if he was there, we weren't going to trade back.
Mhm.
And he said once Indy picked, we had a clear cut idea of where we were headed. Everyone in the room just felt a sigh of relief, so we called off the dogs on other trades and went ahead and picked him, and it felt great. So that's the way that went down. And then right off camera in the draft room, immediately Carroll said he's the closest thing I've seen mentally wise to Troy Polamalu. And then he repeated that quote, to the media a few hours later. But I thought that was interesting as well. All right. And Boyle writes, as the middle part of the first round moves along, the Seahawks are getting closer to their second of 2 picks on the night. Washington takes cornerback Emmanuel Forbes at 16. The Seahawks have 4 players left on their board with first round grades with 3 picks to go. So that little bit of information right there is important in that we know now that Seattle really just had 20 players on their board and 4 were left by the time the 16th player came off the board, and that they were
Mhm.
going to get one of their other first round grade players at 20.
Yeah, and that is, so they knew they were gonna get and you don't trade back in that situation, because if you're at 20 and you've got a player with a first round grade, you take him. And if you trade back to, like, 24 in order to pick up some more picks, now you're picking someone that you don't have a first round grade on anymore. Now
Right.
you're taking a second round player in the first round, and so they're in a situation where they were picking at 20. They weren't moving back.
unless
Um,
unless somebody's just throwing you a boatload of picks that's overvalued. You
yeah,
take in consideration that, but you're right. If your players are no longer valued on the board, you might as well be trading back 2 or 3 times right there, because if you're going to pick at the top of the second round, your value is almost equal to picking at 20 and having a second round grade on a guy.
yeah. So okay, and then as soon as Kalijah Cansey was taken 19, Schneider tells everyone that was in the room that if we're picking, it's gonna be Jackson Smith Njigba, meaning there was no hesitation. Like, if we don't get an awesome offer here, he's our guy because he's the guy on the top of the board. Um, and they were they went ahead, they talked about things, they had some options, but honestly, they didn't, uh the only thing was they thought about, they talked with the, um, VP of Health and Player Performance, who's, Sam Ramsden, about Najigma's, like, hamstring and whether or not that's gonna be fine, and he gave them a clean bill of health and said, "No, just do it." And, yeah, so they were able to grab him, and the Seahawks had Najigma as a top 10 player in the draft, and they were able to
Yeah.
get him at 20, so they were
Yeah.
excited.
So Matt Miller at ESPN just tweeted today, in fact, his list of top um, grades in the draft as far as players picked and when they were picked, and he ranked Jackson Smith and Jigba as the number one overall draft value in the entire draft, because he had valued him as his number 5 overall prospect, and Seattle was able to get him at 20.
Wow.
So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. So it's interesting how that kind of shook out. We all thought maybe they'd trade back a little bit. Nolan Smith was on the board there. A few reach players that we talked about earlier in the draft process, and um, the center prospect Schmitz, as well as Mozzie Smith, was still on the board. Seattle elected just to go best player available. They did this 2 years in a row now, where I think that this entire draft process has shown that they were just going to stick to their board, and regardless of need. I mean, need has to factor in there a little bit, but it's not the predominant thing that they're looking for. And so
Yeah,
that
and,
was pretty cool.
ultimately, I mean, I do like that. You start needing, there's, a need, you start reaching, you start getting players, way earlier than they probably should have gone based on their talent because they're the best defensive end and we don't wanna lose them. Um, and by not doing that, you end up with better players. The only thing when it comes to all of this that gives me a little pause is that they're taking guys at, positions like cornerback and wide receiver rather than the trenches, offensive, defensive line. Um, because I think
But let's talk about that.
that's to me, that's a philosophical thing. I think offense and defensive line are more valuable to winning, um,
But do
than
you necessarily
guys on
have
the
to
edges.
expend those things based on the depth of the draft itself? Some of those players, some of those very good players, in fact, starter level caliber players might be available in day 2, in rounds 2 and 3, possibly even as far as 4. But when you talk about premier talent at corner, premier talent at wide receiver, or quarterback for that example, you got to get those guys up at the top.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree that the quality at wide receiver dropped off faster than the quality of, um, defensive tackle. I think the opposite's true. I think the quality of defensive tackle dropped off much faster than the quality of wide receiver. And as you saw when we did my shadow draft, getting a guy like Mims with the 4th pick, was is still you know, a really, really good receiver, but there weren't any that that quality guards or defensive tackles left. Those guys were all gone by then. So it's just it like I said, it comes down to expending where how do you expend your resources? I think you should always make the biggest investment, whether it be free agent spending or draft capital, on the trenches. That's where football games are won and lost. Um,
And you proved that when you did your shadow draft, and we just had that episode published just yesterday.
yep.
And you did exactly that. Your first 4 picks focused on the interior offense and defensive lines, and I
Yeah.
thought you had a great draft in that respect. That after those picks, it's kind of a wash.
Mhm. Yeah,
It's harder
whatever.
to establish value or whatever. But those first 4 are really important. And let's talk about the next 2 for Seattle.
Yeah.
Um, Boyle says the second round's underway with Notre Dame tight end Michael Mayer going to the Raiders at number 35. The Seahawks are 2 picks away with their top target heading into day 2 still available. Okay, so that's important. They've already got their guy that they're targeting. He's still on their board. Also, He says, "Remember how we said earlier that as the 20th pick approaches, the Seahawks still had 4 players with first round grades left on their board. A day later, one still remains, and it's Auburn outside linebacker Derek Hall standing out alone on the top row of Seattle's board."
Yep.
So,
And then the next, like, at 4:32, the Rams pick TCU guard Steve Avila, and a big cheer goes up around the room. The Seahawks won't be trading
yeah. So
because
you
this
know
is
that
a
Steve Avila then was not probably on their board, or wasn't the type of player that they
he
were looking
wasn't the
for.
top. He wasn't the top player on their board. They saw Hall as a first round pick, like he had a first round grade, and there were only 20 players with first round grades. There were 31 players picked in the first round, but the Seahawks only had 20 that they thought were first round caliber.
Right.
And one of them fell to them in round two.
Which
They,
essentially means they feel like they got 3 first round picks.
yeah, so they weren't saying no to that. And I know that, we had talked about, the Seahawks moving back and getting extra picks and doing some of that, or getting some picks next year when it's a deeper draft and that kind of thing. But you go through this and you go, they never really considered trading. At 5, like yes, they were talking, but as soon as Witherspoon was there, they were like, nope, we're done.
Right.
And in this case, as soon as Avila was the pick right before, and they knew that Hall had fallen to them, that we're not. They're not trading. Like they're
Right.
not even open for business. Um, and with Smith Najigma, like I think the only thing they had was he's going to be the guy. We're a little worried about his hamstring because he only played in 3 games last year, but, um, you know, he's still the guy. So someone had to really blow them away
Mhm.
to have, the Seahawks not pick them. This isn't a case like in past years where they wanted to move down but couldn't find a trade partner and just took someone. The guys that they wanted fell to them, and they took them, and the
Yeah.
trade offers didn't matter that much.
So at this point in the draft, the draft has gone pretty much as well as the Seahawks had hoped. Not us as fans, but the Seahawks had hoped. It fell just that way. Now Hall, if he was gone prior to their pick at 37, from what I understand, the Seahawks were prepared to take Zach Charbonnet at 37 if they couldn't find a trade back partner,
Mhm.
at that spot. So Hall goes off the board. They're working the phones. They're trying to trade back a little bit. If they can't do that, they're prepared to take Zach Charbonnet at 37, and then somebody else had been at 52. I found that interesting as well. Um, okay,
Yeah, they clearly
so
valued Charbonnet high, um, and he fell, and he was available later, which is great for them.
let's count down to the pick 52 after Tampa Bay takes North Dakota State guard Cody Mock at 48. Seattle's 3 picks away from being on the clock again at number 52, and they only have a few players left with second round grades. The Steelers take Wisconsin defensive tackle Keanu Benton, a player that the Seahawks liked, though not their top player left on their board, followed by Green Bay selecting Michigan State receiver Jaden Reed. Seahawks are almost on the clock again, but Carroll, who's only comfortable if he's multitasking, one eye on the corner of the room, showing a basketball game, blah, 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 blah. The Dolphins then select Cam Smith, the cornerback. Schneider's on the phone with the team trying to move up, but a deal doesn't materialize. Charbonnet is the top player left and who the Seahawks want to pick, but they're still going to use their time in case a deal comes up that they can't pass. Carroll says, go with the board to Waldron, and he's in the room. He's a heck of a player. And then Schneider makes the call to Charbonnet, and he's the pick. So,
Yeah.
I actually love this process. They're working the deals. They're figuring it out. They're trusting their board, um, and it really kind of all came together for them. Now, from our perspective, when we were watching the draft together, Keith, we were just a bit frustrated because we had spent the previous 3 months talking about interior trench players that would help this team. This is where the biggest holes were, and we came through free agency still with some of those holes yet to be solved. And we were looking to do that in the draft, and we saw players go that we knew could help the Seahawks. And Keanu Benton was one of those players. He obviously went off the board earlier, but we could have got him at 37, for example. And we wouldn't have thought that that would have been a reach. That would have been a solid pick. Now,
It
Derek
would have been a
Hall's a
solid
fine
pick.
player, and we didn't have him rated as a first round grade. He was borderline second, third round, is where we kind of talked about him in our draft process.
Mhm.
And so there was a little bit of frustration there, but you kind of have to, at that point, you've just got to trust that the Seahawks have, dozens of area scouts and the general manager is one of the finest general managers in the NFL, Coach Pete Carroll and others are in this war room, and they've been there for like weeks at this point, and they're literally, doing the best job that they can, and obviously better than we could do.
Yeah, and, you and I may not have, put Hall as a first round grade, but the Seahawks did, and when it came time, like, he was the top player on their board, and that's who they picked. They didn't pick the guy that's, 4th on their board because he's, a more valuable position, whatever. They took the top player on the board, and in fact, um, out of the first 4 picks, in rounds 1 and 2, all 4 times they took the guy that was at the very top of the board when they were making their pick. There was no shifting around. They just trusted the board and went with it. And that is the process that should happen.
Yeah.
That's
There's
the
no second
process.
guessing. There's no arguing or bantering between coaches or,
No, all that was done a couple weeks earlier. There's
yeah, right.
the board is set. They believe that Charbonnet is the best player available. Not, that's not just like, oh yeah, we're going to use that as our justification. No, he literally was the top player on their board, so they took him.
Yeah. All right. So Seahawks had another pick in round 3, pick 83 overall. As they got closer to that point in the draft, it looked like they were more and more uncomfortable with the players left available for them to select. And they had a couple of trade options available to them. And they decided to get on the phone with Denver while Seattle's on the clock and basically rehash a trade they'd already set up. And, Schneider's just repeating the terms of the trade. And I wanted to put out this detail. He clears up one more detail with Denver, which of their 2 third-round picks next year is coming back to Seattle in the deal. Um, from what I understand, it's the later of either Denver's own third rounder or the one they acquired in a trade with New Orleans. So we get one of those, whichever is the later one.
No,
So
those will be
anyway, that's
similar picks.
yeah. So they make this trade. They move back to the 4th round, trade out of the 3rd round, move to pick 108 overall, which is fairly early in the 4th round. So not a huge move. 25 picks later, something like that. Excuse me. And but we picked up Denver's 3rd round pick in 2024, which is considerably a valuable pick. And essentially, just by moving back 24 spots, we pick up a 3rd round pick. And I kind of love that move, especially if they have grades on players that are somewhat equal in value uh,
Mhm.
for that duration of the draft. And it sounds like they did. And then they ended up picking a player that they had valued in the 3rd round.
Um, so also at the end we're at the end of day 2. And as I'm going through this article, there's a detail in here that, doesn't really mean much as far as the draft, but, it talks about knowing that, Seattle's day is done. Uh, Jody Allen was like, "Let's get some hockey on in here."
Right.
And because wanting to have the Seattle Kraken playoff game on one of the TVs. Um, and I find that to be interesting. One, because, it's another Seattle team that she's rooting for and wants it on there. But she's present. She's not here making these decisions a la, Jerry Jones. Um, she's not asking to approve every one of them. She trusts the people in front of her, but she's still present. She's still part of the room and what's going on. She's asking questions and all of that, which is a stark contrast to what I hear living because I live down in Vancouver now, which is, a suburb of Portland, and all we hear constantly about Jody Allen with the Blazers and how she's a complete absentee owner and she has no say, she doesn't care, like nothing. There's nothing to do with basketball in her life,
Yeah.
and they're just free to do whatever, and there's no ownership that actually wants them to, is pushing them to win. Um, and I find that it's just such a stark contrast between that and
Hmm.
the fact that she's there all 3 days of the draft in the war room with the Seahawks. It's just a different
And
situation.
she has a great relationship with Snyder and Carroll. I mean, she does. And, there's been massive speculation the last 2 years with those two heading into off-season meetings with them right after the season ends about their jobs being on the line and all that kind of, just over and over rehashed endlessly. And she has complete confidence in those guys.
Mhm.
That's apparent, and trust them with this process and with the team and driving the car. So I think we can put that to rest. All right. Snyder went on to later detail in his press conference that he saw several players go off the board and that there were upsets in this draft, meaning that they didn't expect a certain player to go that early in the draft or right before that they selected, and they kind of had to pivot. And he said it was one of the probably the most random drafts that they've had in the 14 years that they've been doing this here in Seattle. So I thought that was interesting as well. And you deal with that, and they do deal with that every year, and they do it well. And
Mhm.
the insights into this process really kind of show that they're able to respond quickly. They're always on the phone with other teams looking to move around. Sometimes those work via Denver, sometimes they don't. So okay, so
The other
let's
thing, when he was saying about the upsets is, there was a bunch of guys that the Seahawks had basically what they call their medical board. They're guys that they have an evaluation on, but they're not drafting them because it doesn't matter how far they drop. They didn't pass the medical exams, and so they had them on the medical board. He said a bunch of guys came off that, and that they had guys come off their free agent board, and they're in the third round. Guys that the Seahawks had rated as
yep.
undrafted free agent level,
Yep.
and they were being
It's
selected.
interesting, Keith, and we talked about this many times. It's not just the Seahawks in a draft, it's 31 other teams as well, and their
Yep.
evaluation process and so forth. Everyone has got an idea of what the draft should look like and what players are valued to them, and on and on and on. It's crazy. It really is interesting how it all works. All right. So Seattle's close to being on the clock in the fourth round. A few picks go off the board. Um, Keely Ringo goes a few picks before Seattle picks at 108. Jake Andrews, one of the top centers left on the board, um, goes to New England. John Boyle writes, this gets a bit of reaction from the room, but not that big of one because the Seahawks had another interior lineman in mind for pick number 108 anyway, as well as another center they really like and would get later in the day. Now that's him just speculating a little bit and kind of throwing that in there at this point in the draft, because Seattle would have no idea if he was going to be available later on at this point. But that was
Well,
kind of
yeah,
their idea and
he
their
didn't,
plan.
and he didn't write this live, right? This is him taking all of his notes and recapping what he saw. Um, but yeah, I mean, the fact that the Seahawks did get a center they really like later in the day is hindsight. But the fact that they were looking, yeah, they want this is a center they liked, but they liked this other this guard more.
Right.
So the center was never going to be the pick unless the guard had gone in one of the picks before. Um, and so I thought that part was kind of interesting.
Yeah. So Anthony Bradford from LSU comes to Seattle at pick 108. Should come in immediately and at least compete for a starting spot there with Haynes over at right guard. So that's great. So as they move forward, Schneider's on the phone while Carroll, Barry, and defensive coordinator Clint Hurt discuss the upcoming pick. There's some other picks that go off the board. Clint Hurt's watching nervously unless Seattle makes a trade, which is always possible. He's one pick away from getting a big interior lineman for his defense, so long as Arizona doesn't beat Seattle to it. Cardinals go with offensive guard John Haynes from UCLA, meaning Seattle's back on the clock, and Hurt is getting his nose tackle he wants for his defense. And so Young is the pick, Cameron Young. And so I love that Hurt's really excited about the pick. That's the guy that they targeted and wanted and came away with. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay,
so I mean, it's one of those things you can, and the way he wrote it is you can say that Clint Hurt's sitting there nervous because there's a guy he wants, but
yeah,
he's not part of the decision tree. If they ask for his input, he'll give it, but um, there's other people that are involved in actually making these decisions. But he can see the board.
yeah,
He knows there's this guy. He wants that player, and he's waiting. And he's real nervous thinking that someone's going to grab the guy that he really wants. And then that didn't happen, and he ended up able to get him. And it's like there's that celebration. And those are kind of I love those little moments,
yeah.
right? Because you get coaches that are like, yes, we got our guy, like get in here, let's get to work. And it's like they're excited to work with this player and that kind of stuff. And it um, just shows you like it's not just like X's and O's and, chess pieces and whatever. These are people and they
Absolutely.
they love what they do and all that. So it's just fun.
Yeah. So Seattle's on the clock again at 151. There was some discussion earlier, possibly about trading and so forth. That did not materialize because the guy that they were wanting at that spot was on the board for them. So they selected Mike Morris. And Hurt gets back on the phone with him and tells him, you don't have to worry about backing up from the table anymore. You keep those damn calories on. You hear me? So he's telling Morris, who's normally plays around 295, he's going to need to probably come in and eventually get to around 310, I would imagine, as
Hmm.
far as weight goes. Okay, and then go
I
ahead.
like this next part because at 154, one of the guys has a trade offer on the phone and asks Snyder if they want to go back. With no hesitation, Snyder gives a quick no before realizing that, in the interest of leaving no stone unturned, he should at least hear what Harline has to tell him. Um, he realized the trade details, and it's still a no, says Schneider, and they make their pick. Like again, this is one of
And
those situations where,
Carol shouts, "We got him!"
yeah, um, this is it's another one of those situations where a guy fell to them, they're not getting cute. That's their guy. They're gonna go get him. He's the top player on their board, and it's someone that they really wanted. But we're still patient enough to get him in the fifth round and not reach for him earlier.
Yeah,
We're
no, I
talking
think
about
it's great.
Michigan center Olu Oluwatimi.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I said that probably
Oluwatimi. Yep.
terribly.
Yeah, you did it. You did about as good as anybody I've heard so far. I think it's great. I wanted to read this part that Carol said. I know it's been a long wait for you, but you've got your place now. You've got to really, you've got a really competitive opportunity too. You come in here with your mindset. You're going to come out and get this job and see if you can own this thing. You're going to get a real good opportunity to take a look at it. So that to me indicates that they expect him to come right in and compete for the starting job in training camp.
Absolutely.
So that's music to my ears. Get a starting center in the fifth round out of this draft. Potentially get a starting guard in the fourth round. You take a look at the top four picks in this draft. All are going to be impact players, starters, or rotation pieces immediately. This draft could, in fact, equal in impact the 2022 draft, Keith.
Which would be insane. And what you didn't mention in there is um, a massive nose tackle and a disruptive 3 tech. That's pretty quick.
Yep.
Those guys are probably both going to be rotational guys as a rookie, but they will have an impact in the next couple of years, provided that they stay healthy and all that. But um,
Yeah, to have 6 or 7 of your players in a draft come in and really be able to compete right away. Now, that's twofold. It shows that there are some holes and, less quality
mhm.
depth on this roster than we'd like it to be. So you've got rookies able to come in right away and take starting jobs and compete. Or you've got such a high quality draft, based in part on where we're picking in the draft. You know, we've got 2 high selections, 2 day 2 selections. We had a third, and when you do that, and you've got 5 picks in the top 100 or whatever, you're going to end up with impact players, no matter what your roster looks like.
Yeah.
All right, so they keep going, obviously, and they're on the clock again. And New Mexico safety Jarek Reed is the pick, um, and
This is a
they're
fun little story. This
yeah.
part.
Go
I
ahead,
mean,
go
you
ahead and tell this one.
well, so what you've got is you've got area scout Ryan Florence, who has basically been pounding the table for Jarek Reed. He's just like, no, this kid is really good. You're gonna love him. We need him. He's a guy. We need him in our on our team, and has just been pounding the table for him. And um, you know, basically Snyder's like, "All right, we're gonna get you your guy," and he doesn't even Schneider doesn't make the call um, to Reed to tell him. He lets Florence do it, which is absolutely unheard of. And so you let this scout who clearly knows this kid now because he's talked to him a few times and
Yeah.
has been pounding the table for him, gets to make the call and be like, "Hey, you're coming up here. We're about to pick you." And I think that's just kind of a cool moment.
Yeah, he said, Jay Reed, hey, it's Flo. We're going to make you a Seahawk right here. You're going to come on in here, get to work, and kick some ass. You know, and Schneider recalled at the press conference, he's one of our favorite players. Carroll praised his aggressiveness and toughness. So love that pick. Um, you know, I watched a little bit of tape today. He's a scrappy little guy. Comes up and runs support and makes tackles. He's not just one of those guys that tries to hit guys low or hit them hard and not wrap up. He's definitely a wrap up tackler as well as hitting hard, in coverage. One of the things I did note is he doesn't get his head around. He had a few interceptions, but those kind of came to him, that were kind of thrown to him. He did have some deflections, some pass breakups, but some of those were due to just his hands being in the receiver's arms, but his head was still turned away from the ball. So I want him to work on that a little bit. But overall, it's a fun pick at that point in the draft. The guy's going to come in and compete right away for special teams, make the roster, hopefully, and then just go from there. So
Yep.
at the end of the draft, you know, what happened with pick 237 was that Schneider just basically said that Georgia running back Kenny McIntosh was, regardless of his testing numbers, which were poor,
Hmm.
he was just too good of a football player to still be available at this point in the draft, and their clear best player available on their board, and that's why they went in that direction.
Yeah, and then the other half of that story is just that when they call him to tell him, that they're drafting him, that he was just crying. Just the emotions just overwhelmed him and couldn't really say much back and was just so happy that to get his dream to be able to, you know, be drafted and play for an NFL team. That he was just crying the whole time. And 20 minutes later, when he did the conference call with the media, it hadn't changed. That he was
Yeah,
still in that state. So,
yeah,
guy that was just absolutely super excited about getting his opportunity to come play for the Seahawks. And I mean, those are the stories. Like, how hard these kids have worked.
absolutely. And
Especially
it's
some
just
of
getting
these guys
started.
that are 7th round picks, like, they they may not have been high recruited into college. They've gotten by working harder than other guys, and to have it pay off and for them and get an opportunity in the NFL is is just it's amazing. Like it's one of those things where you would hope that everyone at some point in their life has that feeling, like that experience of being able to put
Accomplishing.
that much work into something, some accomplishment, and
Yeah.
have it come through.
Yeah.
Like, and it's just these are these are the cool stories that I love about the draft.
I agree. And I mentioned earlier in the other show that we did about Derek Hall. Derek Hall is a preemie baby, born 4 months early,
Mhm.
born without a pulse, without a heartbeat, without breathing, and they had to resuscitate him there on the floor. His mom said that he fit in the palm of her hand, was like just over 2 pounds. Spent months in the emergency or not in IU,
Mhm.
and that's just great. And then went on to be one of the greatest football players in college football. It's just one of those amazing stories. I'm so interested in figuring him out and having him come in and using some of that grit and determination and leadership qualities that he's got to be able to affect this roster. Pete Carroll and John Snyder both said the common theme in this draft was toughness and physicality. Carroll said really from the top to bottom, it's a group that's really going to demonstrate that. We're fired up about that. So, and I am too, because there was a time for probably, from between 2000, I'm going to say 2016 to 2019, maybe 2020, Seahawks lost their edge.
Yeah,
They
they were
lost their physicality. They lost their
starting to play
personality.
soft.
Marshawn Lynch left. A few players on the back end, Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, Cliff Averill, Earl Thomas, all gone. And those guys were the guys that basically established the heartbeat of this team, and the leadership and the physicality and just the attitude. And when that goes, your team's soft. We were not only
Mhm.
soft, but we didn't have any speed, so we were just not very good. And credit to Pete Carroll and company and Russell Wilson for basically pulling us into the playoffs and getting better throughout those years. Even though I thought the identity of the team was a little less than,
Yeah.
but to see that now coming back and being an important kind of tip of the spear moment for this team, I'm excited about that.
Yeah, it is pretty cool to see this team, like, kinda taking that, um I mean, you look at what they've done, like, they've got the best young, set of tandem of corners in the NFL. They've drafted, guys that are tough, physical, sure tacklers that like to hit people and, um, there's nothing soft, there's nothing finesse about these guys. These guys are, um, there's a there's a toughness,
Yeah,
and you need that in the NFL. You need that aspect because you get too finesse, you get too cute with things, and someone will show up and basically punch you in the mouth and beat you. You've got to be able to stand up and fight with those guys, and the Seahawks haven't been able to do that very well. Since Sherman and left and Chancellor got hurt and you know beast mode retired, like
hmm
those were the guys that just really brought it, and they just made everyone else come up to that level of energy, and they've been missing that. And I hope that this draft class and a guy like Tariq Woolen just helps them get it back.
yeah. Well, it sounds like Devin Witherspoon is just as tenacious and physical as they come out of this
Hmm.
draft class, and to pair him with Woolen, dude, that sends shivers down my spine. And Derek Hall is just a beast of a player, and so is Zach Charbonnet. They called him the most physical running back in this draft. Anthony Bradford, dude, 335 pounds at right guard, is one of the most physical right guard guys in this class. Cameron Young, obviously in the middle, he's one of the strongest players in this draft at just 308 pounds, I believe. So he's going to get a little bigger eventually. And then Jarek Reed obviously is a little feisty guy at like 5'8", 189 or something like that. And Kenny
No, he's
McIntosh is also a very physical player.
Yeah. I mean, it's there is a there's a toughness to this draft class, and I like that. I like the fact that um, they went in that direction. I mean, last year they went, um, with the cornerbacks and a couple of offensive tackles and that kind of thing. An outside linebacker who was known as a pass rusher, not really like a thumper or anything. You know what I mean? So to follow up that draft class, which worked out really well, but it had
Mhm.
not necessarily the
It was more
toughness.
focused on speed, you know?
Yeah, it wasn't built around, that toughness and physicality. To back up that speed draft with a toughness draft and really, especially in defense, just really start to build out, the roster in a better way, in a more complete way, really ended up feeling like a good draft class.
Yeah, because it wasn't speed. I mean, Jackson Smith, Njigba is a 4.5 guy. Um, Derek Hall has good speed for his position, but he's still a more stout, edge player at 255, but he looks like a truck. Zach Charbonnet is a 4.5 guy. He's not a very, speedy guy. Um, and Kenny McIntosh ran a 4.62 40. That's one of the reasons why he fell. So they didn't go after
Just
speed in this draft. They went after toughness, resilience, grit, all that
mhm.
kind of stuff, strength. Cool, fun. It'd be great if they did this every year. Just have that little insight. There's no loss. The league's not going to come up with some inside information that they're going to be able to use next year. I think that was really well written and crafted to avoid that, but yet give insights to what was actually happening at the time. It's just fascinating and kind of gives us a little more of a window into the process because you and I are totally into the process of
Oh, yeah.
roster building and strategy. And so it's cool for just us. Now, I don't know if anybody else out there is going to really appreciate this, but I did. I know you did.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was fun, and, it was fun just to see that, and I love the fact that it kept coming back to just trust the board. Take the guy that's at the very top of the board, just take him, and don't worry about it, because that means you're not reaching, you're just getting the best football player that's available when you pick, and
And it's
there's nothing
interesting
wrong with
too,
that.
because no matter how hard we tried, and we tried hard, Keith. I mean, this is one of the most studied drafts that I've ever done, and I've been doing this for a long time. Um, Before the show, just on my own, and since the show, really kind of diving into it. This is one of the years where I just dove in and went, deep in players and so forth, and it just shows how, even with all that work, how far apart my board was compared to the Seahawks board. And I don't know how those get closer, they or get reconciled, or how we figure out what they're going to do in a draft. It's just it's almost impossible. I mean, you had a great shadow draft in the previous show where your picks, where you picked players, were within, I'm just going to say 7 to 10 picks of where they actually went in the draft, which is excellent throughout the
Yeah,
entire process.
there were a few that
That's
were,
really hard to do.
further away, but the fact that my board ended up being pretty reasonable compared to the NFL board, I feel good about because, I mean, we have, like, the consensus big board, NFL mock draft database, but I don't like, it's there, and I know that it's a bunch of, media guys, all their stuff is kinda congealed into one thing, but I didn't go through that. I went through my board, and I went with guys like, Yasir Abdullah, the, super athletic linebacker out of Louisville, and, they had him going in, like, the 6th round, and I felt weird taking him in the 4th round. But then the NFL took him with the first pick of the 5th round, so I'm like, "Okay, so I'm not that far off," even though it felt weird and it felt like I was doing something that was gonna come back and bite me on the show. It ended up working out, so,
Yeah.
um,
Traits are
I
traits.
yeah, and I do like drafting traits. I mean, that's part of it. I learned that from Zach Whitman, from Seahawk Twitter, and also from
Hmm.
Three Sigma Athlete. Like, he really did a big study on athleticism and what it means, and NFL success and that kind of stuff, and learned a lot from listening to him. And yeah, I mean, you got that kind of athleticism and speed, draft him.
Yeah,
Do it.
for sure. All right, let's get out of here. Find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NW Seahawk. The show's on YouTube. If you're watching the show, you know that. If you're not, if you're listening to this on the audio side, we've got a YouTube channel. Check it out. Just look up Seahawks Playbook on YouTube and hit that subscribe button. Find us on your favorite podcast platforms, all of them, essentially. And if you find one out there that we're not on, we'll make sure we add that to the list.
Let us know. We'll make sure we get added to it.
All right. Take care, guys. See ya.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.